There's a family whose story has been buried under 2 centuries of silence. A dynasty so powerful and so deeply woven into modern history that most people have never even heard their name. Before Big Pharma, before the Sacklers, before the age of billion-dollar settlements and prescription pad empires, there were the Sassoons. They didn't just profit from addiction. They industrialized it, systematized it, and spread it across an entire civilization until the damage was so vast it changed the destiny of Asia. And somehow, they walked away celebrated, knighted, and carved into the heart of global finance like royalty, instead of the architects of one of the most devastating narcotics economies in recorded history. The story begins with David Sassoon, the founder of the dynasty. Born in Baghdad in 1792 to Sheikh Sassoon ben Saleh, the chief treasurer of the city. When political pressure and anti-Semitic persecution threatened the family's safety, David fled with nothing but his connections, his experience, and a deep understanding of how money and power interact behind closed doors. He made his way first to Persia, then across the Arabian Sea, and finally to Bombay, the exploding economic frontier of the British Empire. And when he arrived, he didn't just adapt. He recognized instantly that the British had built the perfect machine for profit, and they only needed someone bold enough to scale it. Bombay in the 1830s was not a city. It was a global node, a place where the British East India Company had fused state authority with corporate greed. It operated as its own autonomous kingdom, controlling huge armies, collecting taxes, enforcing laws, and treating India as a commercial extraction zone. Its crown jewel was the opium system, fields of poppies stretching across Bengal, processed into bricks, packed into chests, and funneled to China, where millions would become addicted. David Sassoon saw this not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity for empire building, because he understood what nobody else did. Whoever controlled the logistics controlled the world. While average merchants bought opium at auction and sold it to smugglers, the Sassoons took over the entire supply chain. They financed farmers, built warehouses, controlled shipping fleets, established insurance firms, and planted family members in strategic posts across Asia's port cities. Every step of opium's journey, seed to ship to smoker, passed through Sassoon hands. And in a colonial world where official British entities couldn't look too dirty, the Sassoons became the indispensable middlemen. David Sassoon trained his sons like generals, dispatching them to Canton, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Singapore, Yokohama, and Calcutta. Each one became a node in a global narcotics empire that dwarfed every modern cartel in scale, revenue, and political protection. Elias Sassoon opened the first foothold in China. Frederick II, Albert the political liaison, Reuben the financier who built the banking arm that still influences international markets today. Together, they formed a dynasty that British officials bragged about in Parliament as a model merchant family, even while the Chinese economy crumbled under the weight of narcotics addiction. By the 1850s, the Sassoons controlled over 70% of the entire opium trade into China, shipping tens of thousands of chests per year. Each chest weighed around 140 pounds, meaning millions of pounds of narcotics every year were pouring into Chinese cities, villages, and ports, saturating every level of society. Addiction soared to unprecedented levels. Scholars, laborers, soldiers, merchants, servants, millions were destroyed. And as China staggered, the Sassoons ascended effortlessly into global aristocracy. But when China finally acted, when Commissioner Lin Zexu confiscated and destroyed over 1,400 tons of opium in 1839, it triggered the First Opium War, which the British used as justification to invade. British officials relied heavily on Sassoon intelligence networks, supply chains, warehouses, and financial reserves. When the war ended, the ports were forced open, silver indemnities were extracted, and the Sassoons gained even more access than before. And when the Second Opium War ended in 1860, opium was officially legalized, a moment that transformed the Sassoon business from a smuggling empire into a global corporate titan. By the mid-19th century, Sassoon was becoming synonymous with merchant prince across the British Empire. They built banks, textile mills, shipping companies, trading houses, real estate networks, and political alliances that stretched from London to Shanghai. Their wealth was so vast and so deeply entangled in British financial systems that David Sassoon's son, Albert Abdullah David Sassoon, was eventually knighted by Queen Victoria. And nobody mentioned the fact that the family had earned its fortune by addicting a civilization. The Sassoons understood reputation laundering centuries before the term existed. They poured money into charities, synagogues, schools, hospitals, orphanages, and major infrastructure in Bombay. They established libraries, docks, and public institutions that still exist today, all bearing their name like monuments to generosity. Meanwhile, the true source of their fortune was quietly erased from public memory. This is where the playbook becomes disturbingly familiar, because this is the same strategy used by modern pharmaceutical giants who have been repeatedly sued, fined, or exposed for dangerous, deceptive, or harmful drug-related practices. Documented legal cases, settlements, and federal investigations reveal a repeating pattern. Profit first, concealment later, philanthropy always. And the Sassoons mastered every step of this long before Big Pharma existed. Consider the publicly documented opioid crisis of the 1990s and 2000s. Companies like Pharma aggressively marketed oxycodone while downplaying addiction risk, a strategy that led to one of the most deadly drug epidemics in U.S. history. Johnson was accused in legal filings of supplying raw opioid materials and promoting addictive formulations. McKesson, AmerisourceBergen, and Cardinal Health, the big three U.S. drug distributors, were all fined for failing to report suspicious opioid shipments, allowing billions of pills to flood towns that could not possibly have needed them. These are documented, legally established facts, not accusations. The settlements exist. The fines exist. The public records exist. And yet, in each case, the company survived. Just like the Sassoons. While the Sassoons didn't invent the idea of drug empires, laundering their reputations through donations and institutional influence, they refined it into an art form. They understood that once your name is carved into a library, a university wing, or a hospital, it becomes harder for society to reconcile philanthropy with harm. This exact dichotomy still appears today when massive pharmaceutical settlements appear in the news on the same week those same companies fund medical research programs, academic partnerships, or community grants. Nothing has changed except the substances and the marketing. Back in the 19th century, Sassoon agents operated out of Shanghai's Bund, a space that would later become the financial artery of Asia. They built monumental buildings, Sassoon House, Cathay Hotel, and numerous trading halls, solidifying their legacy as builders of cities rather than destroyers of societies. To the public, they were philanthropists. To the British Empire, they were strategic partners. To China, they were the architects of a national catastrophe. And as the dynasty grew wealthier, the narrative around them grew cleaner. Meanwhile, China reeled from the consequences. Addiction rates soared so high that Qing dynasty officials describe entire cities where productivity collapsed, families disintegrated, and local governance broke down. Silver flowed out of China in such staggering quantities that it destabilized the national economy and caused inflation crises lasting decades. And every ounce of that silver was absorbed by British banks and Sassoon counting houses. This was more than a drug epidemic. It was economic warfare disguised as trade. And the blueprint has survived. Modern pharmaceutical giants use tactics that echo the Sassoon strategy. Aggressive promotion, influence within regulatory systems, massive distribution networks, misrepresentation of risks as documented in court cases, and philanthropic reputation laundering. Even after paying multi-billion-dollar fines, many of these corporations remain profitable and operational. Just like the Sassoons, who stayed powerful for generations after the height of their opium empire. The deeper you go into the Sassoon story, the more the parallels sharpen. Because the Sassoons didn't just profit from opium, they engineered global addiction at an industrial level. And yet today, streets, buildings, and institutions still carry their name with pride. The Sassoons may have built the old world's drug empire, but the blueprint they created lived on long after their ships stopped sailing. Their system didn't die. It simply evolved, adapted, and changed its name. Today, The same machinery operates behind glass towers instead of opium dens, with corporate boardrooms replacing colonial counting houses and pharmaceutical lobbies replacing private armies. The actors changed, the products changed, the marketing changed, but the underlying engine, mass dependency, controlled supply, manufactured legitimacy, stayed exactly the same. If you want to understand the modern world's drug cartels, don't look to street corners. Look up at skyscrapers, at shareholders, at glossy PR videos that talk about healing, innovation, and saving lives. Look behind the press releases and promises and you'll see a playbook almost identical to what the Sassoons perfected 2 centuries ago. State protection, market dominance, strategic philanthropy, and most importantly, the ability to turn human suffering into recurring revenue. That's the point most people miss about the pharmaceutical model. It's not built on cures. Cures end revenue streams. What sustains the empire are long-term treatments, lifelong prescriptions, and chemical dependencies disguised as management. It's the same logic the Sassoons used when they turned China into a captive customer base. A healthy population is unprofitable. A dependent population is an empire. One of the clearest modern parallels is the opioid crisis. Not the street-level chaos people saw on the news, but the boardroom decisions that caused it. Over the past few decades, several major American companies have faced billions in fines and settlements for their documented involvement in opioid overdistribution and deceptive marketing. Government reports, legal filings, congressional investigations, and public testimony showed a system that maximized volume, minimized oversight, and encouraged aggressive expansion, even as addiction numbers skyrocketed. These weren't rogue actors in back alleys. They were some of the largest pharmaceutical distributors and manufacturers in the country. To anyone who knows the Sassoon story, none of this is new. The mechanics are identical. In the 1800s, the Sassoons didn't just sell opium. They shaped the very laws that enabled it. They knew that controlling the regulatory environment was more powerful than controlling any ship or warehouse. Back then, they worked with colonial officials. Today's pharma industry works with regulators, lobbyists, and political committees. In both eras, the most profitable drug deals were signed not in dark rooms, but in government-approved arrangements. The real secret of every drug empire is respectability. As long as you appear legitimate, the moral questions fade. The Sassoons mastered this by constructing libraries, hospitals, and public works. They placed their name on institutions until the public no longer saw them as merchants of addiction, but as benevolent builders of society. The same transformation happened in modern times on a much larger scale. The names of major pharmaceutical benefactors appear on museum wings, university research centers, and humanitarian projects worldwide. The structure is the same. Extract wealth from dependency, then launder it through philanthropy. Here's where the comparison grows even sharper. In modern America, documents from regulatory cases revealed that distributors shipped millions of opioid pills into towns with only a few thousand residents. Internal emails and reports disclosed that suspicious orders were flagged repeatedly, but still processed. Some companies paid record-breaking settlements after investigations found that their monitoring systems failed to curb obviously dangerous distribution patterns. These aren't conspiracy theories. These are documented findings from legal proceedings and congressional hearings. The Sassoons would have understood this perfectly. The British East India Company once claimed that they were meeting demand and providing a product the market clearly wanted. 200 years later, pharmaceutical executives use similar language: demand, pain management, expanding access, patient need, to justify skyrocketing prescription numbers. In both cases, addiction wasn't a side effect. It was the business model. But the comparison doesn't stop at opioids. Look broader. Look at the entire architecture of modern dependency. Antidepressants prescribed for decades at a time. Anti-anxiety medications known for addictive potential. Stimulants that reshape the brain's reward pathways. And long-term medications where withdrawal can be worse than the condition itself. Millions of people worldwide rely on chemicals not to get high, but to function, to work, to sleep, to wake, to cope. A dependent population isn't a tragedy for an industry built on continuity. It's a customer base. This isn't to say modern medicine hasn't saved lives. It has, but that's the brilliance of the system. Good outcomes mask the economic incentives underneath. The Sassoons funded schools and hospitals in Bombay, which genuinely helped people, even as their product destroyed lives in China. Modern pharmaceutical giants fund research labs and life-saving innovations even as they settle lawsuits for illegal marketing practices, data manipulation, or distribution failures. Both can be true at once. Progress and destruction are not mutually exclusive when profit is the governing principle. Consider how global health guidelines and prescription standards evolve. Major companies have been investigated for influencing clinical studies, suppressing negative data, or promoting off-label uses through aggressive marketing. These aren't allegations. They're matters of public record. When a corporation can shape what doctors are taught, what medical journals publish, and what patients ask for, the line between medicine and marketing disappears. The Sassoons shape culture through economic pressure. Today's pharmaceutical firms shape it through research funding, lobbying, and outreach campaigns. And the numbers reveal the scale. While the Sassoons move tens of thousands of opium chests per year, modern pharmaceutical markets move billions of dollars per quarter. Chronic disease management, mental health medication, pain treatment, and lifestyle pharmaceuticals form some of the most profitable sectors in the global economy. Dependency is no longer seen as a crisis. It's a metric on a quarterly earnings report. A permanently medicated population is the modern version of a population hooked on opium. The political influence is the final piece of the puzzle. In the Sassoon era, the British government fought wars to defend opium trade routes. Today, political systems defend pharmaceutical markets through regulatory capture, lobbying, and legal insulation. Investigations into the opioid crisis reveal deep entanglements between corporations, political donors, and regulatory agencies. Officials move between government and industry positions in revolving door patterns, shaping policy in ways that benefited the companies they later joined. This is not speculative. Reports documented these transitions and their influence on oversight. The result is clear. The architecture of protection around modern drug companies mirrors the protection the Sassoons enjoyed from the British Empire. Just as the East India Company shielded the Sassoons from consequences in the 1800s, modern systems shield pharmaceutical corporations even after settlements, fines, or investigations. The empire protects the engine that fuels it. But the most important parallel is what happens when the damage becomes undeniable. In the Sassoon era, addiction devastated China. When the crisis grew too large to hide, when millions were hooked, when productivity collapsed, when social fabric tore apart, the same British Empire that facilitated the trade turned around and declared itself the moral authority against drug use at home. Modern parallels follow the same arc. The opioid crisis destroyed communities across the United States. For years, addiction numbers rose with little intervention. Then, when the crisis became impossible to ignore, lawsuits and investigations exploded. Settlements were paid. Executives apologized publicly. But the companies remained, the wealth remained, and new markets emerged. This is the part people rarely understand. Drug empires don't disappear. They transition. They evolve. When one product becomes too controversial, they pivot to another. The Sassoons pivoted from opium to cotton, real estate, and banking. Modern pharma pivots from opioids to other long-term drug classes. The products change, but the dependence remains. Human biology becomes predictable revenue. Look at how antidepressant prescriptions have skyrocketed globally. Look at how ADHD medications have become a billion-dollar industry. Look at the rise in anti-anxiety prescriptions or the surge in medications for sleep disorders. Many of these medications help people, but they also lock patients into long-term regimens where stopping is nearly impossible. Withdrawal effects, rebound symptoms, and chemical dependency create cycles that last years, sometimes decades. That isn't accidental. It's part of the economics of chronic treatment. The Sassoons didn't need people to die. They needed them to need. Modern pharma doesn't need people to suffer. It needs them to manage. In both models, dependency is not a scandal. It's a strategy. And that brings us to the final truth. Nothing has changed. Not really. The Sassoons built their empire on a lie that became a system. The lie that addiction could be sold as medicine, that dependency could be disguised as treatment, and that philanthropy could erase the past. Today, the lie is more sophisticated, more scientific, more respectable. But it's still the same lie. When you see a pharmaceutical giant pay a multi-billion-dollar settlement, realize that the settlement is not the end of the empire. It's the cost of keeping it. When you see a corporation donate to universities or hospitals, realize the donation is not an apology. It's reputation insurance. When you hear an ad promising a better life through chemistry, remember that every empire built on dependency frames its product as salvation. The Sassoons understood this in the 1800s. Big Pharma understands it now. And in another 100 years, the next empire will understand it too. Because as long as human suffering can be monetized, there will always be a family, a company, or an entire system willing to turn pain into profit.